Learning is a change in your mind, and no one else can do it for you. You have to make it happen yourself. This is the science of learning, and I'm Keith Sawyer, and I'm here with Janet Kolodner, who's been involved with the science of learning, the learning sciences, from the beginning of the field in the 1980s and the 1990s. And Janet, welcome to the Science of Learning podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I thought I'd start by asking you, how would you define learning?
I think learning is changes over time in an individual or a community that affect the ways that they behave or think or do things, over as a result.
So something that some of our viewers might be wondering, I said, and I know you'd say as well, that the learning sciences started in the 1980s and the 1990s, but surely scientists have been interested in how people learn for much longer than that, the
Of course.
1800s, and
Of course.
behaviorists were studying learning in the 1950s. So what does it mean to say the learning sciences started in the 1980s? Can you
Well, the
unpack that?
field called the learning sciences began in the late 1980, early 1990, as a field, as a specific field. There were people from cognitive science, people from educational psychology, people from cognitive psychology, people from, did I say education, math education, science education, educational psychology, who were kind of chafing at the bit because what their disciplines or interdisciplinary disciplines were doing was so far removed from what they were actually experiencing in the real world as they were seeing in the real world as they were studying learning. And so much of what people were doing in cognitive psychology, and even in cognitive science, right, was looking at changes in memory, cognition over time, but doing it in a lab and doing it in really like non-real situations. Whereas in educational psychology, what was going on was everything was about classrooms and tweaking the edges of classrooms, learning enough to tweak the edges of classrooms. I might get in trouble for that. Um, but but people were noticing that learning was more than just a cognitive activity, that there's a social dimension to it, and we knew there was a developmental dimension to it, but those weren't usually looked at. Cognitive and developmental were not generally looked at the same time. In developmental psychology, small kids, maybe it was. That most of the work was not happening. I'm sorry, most of the research was not happening in the real world, and when people were looking at learning in the real world, they were seeing how much the culture played a role, the kinds of norms that people were used to. They were noticing that people were able to for example, math in the real world, do arithmetic in the real world, independent of the way it was taught in school, and maybe independent of school. Maybe they never went to school. And they certainly weren't doing it always the way that school was teaching people how to do it. Um, the researchers in those fields were not looking at affect. They weren't looking at the emotion, that drives learning, right? The emotion that's affected by learning. So they weren't looking at the relationship to emotion. And so there were a whole bunch of us in a lot of different fields that were, really antsy. We needed each other. It's kind of like the beginning of cognitive science, but in this case, focusing on learning. And so, of course, I mean, Dewey is one of our heroes. Bruner is one of our heroes. You know, some of us were doing this work way before there was a field called the learning sciences, but it was time for it.
When you say antsy, I think you mean these traditional psychologists. They have this research approach where it's like an experiment where you have an individual in the laboratory and you do a very controlled kind of experiment, but you aren't out in the world like in a classroom or an apprentice in a
Well,
workshop.
the other thing is you're not having them in a situation where their emotions are affecting them, where their social relationships are affecting them, um, but you're not giving them things to do where their culture affects them. Um, and you're not looking at developmental things at the same time. So that's really, what the being antsy was about, was that not simply that it was happening in labs, but that it was study of a little thing at a time without working to understand all the different things in the real world that affected how people would think, what people would learn, how people would change.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask about you and your background in that research. You got your PhD in 1980 at Yale, so you were doing research in the 1970s. So, what kind of research were you doing? Were you
Well,
doing
I
uh,
was trying to make the computer smart, and I was trying to make the computer be able to. I started out my PhD work. I wanted to make the computer be able to remember its experiences. I'll tell you what that means in a moment. And then I wanted it, when I got to my first position at Georgia Tech, I moved on to wanting the computer to be able to solve problems using its experiences, so and learn from experience. And so what? Let me tell you what I mean by the computer learning from its experience. Back in the olden days of AI, we were trying to understand intelligence, understand cognition, understand learning um, as processes, whether it was human processes or animal processes or whatever it was. We were trying to understand learning um, kind of by making an analogy to people. Okay, so there were the expert systems people who were focusing on what's the knowledge that people are using, how can we collect that knowledge and make the computer be able to use knowledge like that. And where I came from in Roger Shank's world was what are the processes that allow us to be able to understand each other and interact with each other. Um, and how is the knowledge that we used? How might it be represented? How might we be able to recognize that after John gave the ball to Mary, Mary had the ball? I mean, how would we know things like that? And if he gave it to her, he probably wanted her to have it, at least for a short time. So how do we know things like that? So that's what that research was focused on. And some people will know that Roger invented a way of representing knowledge called conceptual dependency that allowed the kind of inferences that I was just talking about. But it was always an incremental approach. So it started with that. And then when that wasn't enough, he moved on to, and his research moved on to, well, there are things that we do over and over in the world, and those have an effect also. And what's that knowledge look like? And how do we use that? Those were called scripts. Okay, and there's certain kinds of decisions we make. We plan, what do we use for planning? How are they related to scripts? How are they related to this conceptual dependency stuff? Um, and on and on. And I got there as a student at the time when it was really clear to Roger that that what we were holding in our long-term memories, and not the facts, but the experiences that we had had and that we have in our long-term memories, and that we create more, um, we create knowledge from. Okay. How does that evolve, and how do we need to process our memories to be able to retrieve them later? I was going to say to be able to remember them later, but to be able to retrieve them later. And how's that retrieval process work? So that was what my PhD work was about. And I created a piece of software called Cyrus that could answer questions about Cyrus Vance. When he was Secretary of State of the United States, this was during Jimmy Carter, 1976, and I think went till 1989, maybe late 1988. And then Muskie came in, and people were saying to me, "Well, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "Well, I'll build a Muskie memory. I mean, what am I going to do now?" My research didn't depend on whether Cyrus Vance was still doing what Cyrus Vance did. But anyway, so I coded up representations of bunches of events in Cyrus Vance's life, some early ones, some developing ones, because I was just trying to understand a lot of different things. I thought about, we have different eras in our lives. I know that's, that Taylor Swift talks about eras, but I was talking about eras before her. And we have different eras in our lives, and that helps us, specify, figuring out what era something came from helps us to remember it or remember more about it. But that wasn't getting at the day-to-day memories. So that's when I started collecting newspaper articles and coding that into the computer, what he was doing from day to day. One of my colleagues, Jerry DeYoung, was working on a piece of software called Frump. And what that did was it skimmed newspaper articles and it made summaries. So I started using what came from Frump after a while, because Frump was coding the articles, not as well as I coded them, but not in as much detail. And then I was focused on how do you label, or it called it indexing. How do you label things in memory so that you know something else that you experience is similar to something else, and that allows you to make inferences? How do you remember other things so that you can make generalizations about it? And then I was worried about the issues of how do you search a memory, and find, in my case, I was doing it to find answers. So you could ask Cyrus, when was the last time that Cyrus Vance was in Israel? And it would tell you. And you could ask, when was the last time he met with Menachem Begin, who was prime minister of Israel at that time? And it would tell you. And if it didn't know, it would, the word nowadays is hallucinate, but it would figure out that probably it was the last time he was in Israel, because that was when he saw Menachem Begin last. And if I asked it, has Vance's wife ever met Mrs. Begin? Okay, then it would say, well, gee, their husbands know each other. They get together for diplomatic trips. They get together for diplomatic meetings. It might have happened during a diplomatic meeting. Diplomatic meetings often include state dinners. That's a social event where their wives might have been. So maybe they met maybe they met at a state dinner, which pretty much matches the way that we figure those things out. So Cyrus was able to do that. And at that same time, expert systems were being promoted as, the next big thing since sliced bread. And there were programs that could, as I said before, they were extracting the knowledge of experts, putting in the computer and manipulating that. And there were programs that could diagnose infections, bacterial infections, and using the same kind of primitive representations that we were using back then. But there were programs that could do a variety of medical things. They could do some math things. There were a bunch of things that they could do, and it was really vexing to me, and also to Roger, that those were called expert systems because they weren't experts at all. They didn't get better over time. I mean, experts aren't just people who know things. Experts are also people who learn things along the way. So, and they're able to learn things, more sophisticated things than the rest of us, right? Because they already have a basis for doing that. So what I did when I went to Georgia Tech in 1980, I graduated, went to Georgia Tech in 1980, and I wanted to look at how those memories that I now knew how to store in memory and how to retrieve, how to use those to solve problems. And how to use, I was already doing some machine learning with what I'd been doing before. And I moved into solving problems. And my work was focused on the computer solving problems based on its experiences. So the first piece of software we worked on, I was working with a doctor, Rob Kolodner, who's not related to me, but he was a psychiatrist. He was interested in computing. Later on, he worked in the technology office of some president, or maybe it was the VA, on computer systems. And I said, well, I don't do expert systems, but I do this other stuff. Why don't we go through some of your cases and you'll tell me about how you solve those problems? And so I got to, experience his case-based reasoning, the way he used his experiences to solve problems. I got to experience that. And then one of my undergraduates, Keith McGregor, who later got a PhD, he wrote a little program that could differentiate between patients who had depression with a little bit of schizophrenia involved, and people who had schizophrenia with a little bit of depression involved. And that was the first case-based reasoner we built. We later built software. It was always for some reason, to identify the next thing that was an important issue to work on. The first one was simply about how do we make it work a little bit. We had some of my students my first two PhD students worked on mediation, negotiation and mediation, looking at, let me see, the first one, Bob Simpson, worked on how should Israel and Egypt solve the Sinai issue? Israel had captured Egypt in, I guess, the 1973 war, and had captured the Sinai, not Egypt, in the 73 war. Egypt wanted it back. Israel was willing to do that, but they needed to figure out how to do it. Israel wanted security. Egypt wanted its land, so wanted sovereignty. And the program could remember Bob Simpson built in other negotiating experiences. And it could remember that the Korean War conflict, which never really got solved, but it ended in a separation of the lands, and suggested that. And Egypt and Israel both came back. Oh, they weren't involved, but we said they both came back and said, it doesn't work for us. That doesn't work for me. That doesn't work for me. I want all of Egypt. I want safety, And then I can't remember what the other example was, but there was another example where land rights and security rights were given to each of the two sides, to one side or the other. I can't remember what that was. Anyway, so it went on and it adapted that solution to the Sinai Desert and on from there. And then my second PhD student, Katya Sakara, worked with a mediator to find out how a mediator actually did his job. And then wrote a program that could do a lot of things that mediator did. I'm not remembering a lot of details of these things. That was back in the early 1980s, mid 1980s. But we worked out a lot of things about how to get the computer to learn from its experiences, and that was called case-based reasoning. And we started a case-based reasoning workshop, and there's an international case-based reasoning workshop that continues to meet now every other year. So it's been turned out to be an important thing. I should mention one other two others of the things that we did. We wanted to understand case-based design.
First, let me ask for viewers who don't know. First, just to clarify, so your PhD is in computer science. So I think people will know by now that you're talking about developing software. So we're not talking about psychology experiments anymore.
That's right.
You're talking about doing artificial intelligence, which is fascinating. This is the 1970s and 1980s. So AI didn't start last year.
Right.
And you're talking about programming computers to learn some fascinating things. So can you say what is case-based reasoning before you tell us about the next?
Let me say one other thing before I say that, and then I will.
Okay.
One other thing I should say is that we wanted to, when I was in grad school, we wanted to base what we were building on the computer off of people. But there was very little research about how people remember their past experiences. The most important research for us was from Bartlett back in 1932.
Wow.
And I won't talk about what he did, but so there really was very little at that time. So we had to figure it out for ourselves. And that was one of the reasons that all my students were working with experts of one kind or another, because they needed to see how some particular kind of solving problems based on experience and learning from experience was actually happening. So case-based reasoning, I'm sorry that I talked about it without defining it. So case-based reasoning is a process that we created for the computer to be able to reason based on its past experiences. It includes A lot of, I don't know how much you want me to say. I'm sorry.
Oh, how about the 30-second definition?
Well, I just gave you the 30-second definition.
All right, good. So, yes, that sounds a lot like what, I guess our Gen AI machine learning algorithms are doing today. You're training them on data
Yeah.
sets.
However, however, okay, what they're doing nowadays is based on patterns. Okay, it's not based on, and it requires lots and lots and lots and lots of data, lots and lots and um, lots of data, lots of experiences, lots of data points, and what which is not at all how people do it. I mean, when we learn language, there are things that we learn that way. Okay, certainly we learn language. Um, Not entirely the way the computer does it, but certainly it has a lot in common. But that's not the way that we learn to be expert at something. The way we learn to be expert at something is by having experiences, making decisions, experiencing the effects of those decisions, um, being surprised when things don't happen the way that we thought they would, seeking explanations for why not, um, and updating what we know based on what we learn. I would also say that we do some anticipation if it's important enough to us. We do some anticipation of how this new thing that we just figured out or we just learned will be useful to us in the future. So it's a whole different learning process from experience. There's a piece of it, where you've got some things that are the same as each other and you're making a generalization that, are similar. But there's no explanatory part to what happens today in AI, and it requires a tremendous amount of data.
Right. So I wanted to bring that
Thank you.
back to the founding of the learning sciences research because your story is fascinating. And I think it's a great example of the sorts of things that were going on, right? In the 1980s, you weren't the only one working in this sort of artificial intelligence, computer science type of work that then led to the study of how people learn, right? So even
Yeah,
though,
so I mean, I was already looking a lot at how people learn, not in terms of doing experiments, but doing a lot of interviewing people, and then building models on the computer. I mean, these smart things that my systems could do were not just smart systems. I mean, they're pretty primitive, you know, compared to today's systems. But they were also served for us as models of cognition. So um, and that was one of the origins of the learning sciences was that we were looking at learning very differently and in very different kinds of situations than most psychologists or computer scientists were looking at, or most cognitive scientists were looking at. But there were also a bunch of cognitive scientists who were doing work in education. I'm thinking Andy DeSessa, I'm thinking Alan Schoenfeld, um, um, Anne Brown, people who were trained as some of them were trained as behavioral scientists, but behavioral psychologists or cognitive psychologists. And they found when they went out in the world and they started looking at how learning was actually happening, as I said before, they were finding all these other things that were important. And then they were designing curriculum, they were designing curricular approaches, educational approaches that took those things into account, but they also didn't have a community. So it was a people coming from a variety of different areas that just didn't have the community. And in 1989, in 1988, I was on sabbatical in Boston, and I was visiting. I told this story to at the Learning Sciences conference, but I I was um, in Boston on sabbatical, and I was talking to Alan Collins, and I said, Alan, the cognitive science is just it's getting boring. I mean, it's turning into a formal science, and we're not doing people aren't doing discovery of things anymore. It's turning very, like physics. And I said, we need a new journal. And he said, well, you you're going to start that journal. Your generation is going to start that journal. I've already done it. And a year later, I think it was at a cognitive science conference, not a learning science. It was at a cognitive science conference. I believe it was in Michigan, in Ann Arbor. Roger came up to me and he said, "We're gonna need we need a new journal. We're going to call it Journal of the Learning Sciences. I want you to be one of the editors, and I'm going to find two more for you. You're going to do it the same way we did the Cognitive Science Journal originally." And I said, "Well, you can try and find me two people, but they have to be as conscientious as I am." And he came back to me a few weeks later and he said, "Okay, how about you do it yourself?" And I said, "Okay, I'll do it myself." So, I mean, I was prepared for that, right? Alan had already told me. So he sent me to talk to Larry Erlbaum, the publisher. And I went to talk to him and he gave me a ton of advice. But what I really needed to do, I mean, the first thing I needed to do was talk to some of these people I had named. Talk to Alan Collins, talk to Alan Schoenfeld, talk to Andy DeSessa, and bunches and bunches of other people, and find out what they weren't unhappy about and what they were looking for. So
Right.
where did this journal have to go? And we weren't exactly sure where it would go. I thought that the AI folks, the ones I grew up with, I thought that they would continue to be part of it for a while, but they were not. They were on to other things, and it became more of an education journal. And I thought that the AI and education people, they were part of our community for a while. And then I don't know what happened, but they found the AI and education community to be the one they wanted to be in. So the learning sciences became an interdisciplinary science that focuses on learning as it's happening in the real world, and not just school, that's our real world, but learning happens as we talk to each other in discussion right now, right? Learning happens when we go to museum. Learning happens when children and their parents are interacting with each other. Parents learn and children learn too. Learning happens when, you sit around a room knitting. Okay, learning happens in in a rocket club where you're setting off rockets and trying to make them better and better. It happens in a lot of different situations. And grown-ups, grown-ups get involved with their hobbies. You want to do a better job of growing things in your garden. You join a group of people and you have learning happen in the community, and you have learning happen across the community. So we're interested in all of that, and in the interactions between the cognitive, the social, the emotional, the developmental um, processes, and all the things that impact that. So, for example, power relationships are something that's really big in the learning sciences right now.
Yeah. So the early parts of your career with your computer science degree in 1980, and I know looking at your CV, you've developed a lot of software applications and the stories you were telling. So I'm curious. I wanted to ask you about that period in the
Yeah.
1980s again. And you were developing software, you could have continued developing software. So I'm wondering, how did you end up even meeting all of these education researchers? They would have been going to different conferences. You might have
Okay.
only, yeah, how did
Well,
you
I
meet
told
them?
you already that I was interviewing all of them. So
Right?
that was one way I met them. The other thing is what that I started the journal. The first issue came out in 1991, but I was started interviewing people in the end of 1989, and all through 1990 I was interviewing people and I was getting papers reviewed, and I was reading the papers and I was reading the reviews, and I learned a lot about learning in the real world. And I met a lot of people along the way. Sometimes through their writing, sometimes through other people telling me, "Here's who you should use for a reviewer for that." Alan Collins was really good at that for me, and Jim Greeno and Bob Glazer. Um, and um, so that was a lot of it. But also, we had our first Learning Sciences conference in 1991 or 92, and it did bring together all of these people.
Yeah,
Um,
1991. Oh, that'd be a great story to talk about. So at Northwestern, I remember hearing about it. I wasn't there in 1991, the very first International
well,
Conference of the Learning Sciences.
Yes, Roger Schenck thought that he wanted to bring the AI and education people into what we were doing. So he basically took over the AI in education, or maybe it was the intelligent tutoring systems, I don't know, conference, and he made it into what he wanted it to be. And he invited a bunch of speakers. I don't know if there were contributed papers or not. Um, I did find the proceedings from something, and I don't know if it was the first one or the second one, but I would have to look at that to know. But in the first one, he had a lot of speakers who, were the same people who were writing for the journal and the same people I was using to review articles for the journal. So Marlene Scardamelia um, talked about knowledge building, and um, I'm not remembering.
Yeah, there is a proceedings, by the way. I'll put a link to it in the show notes for the episode.
Okay, well, the one that you sent me the pages for,
Yeah, I think I did.
yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know if that was the first one or not. I have to look at it and
Uh,
see. Yeah, I
right.
have to
And the
look at it and
journal,
see.
right, started in 1989. Is that right? I'm
First one
looking.
came out in 91.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah,
You
I
were the
started working
editor.
on it I started working on it towards the end of 89.
Right,
Um,
right. So
yeah,
that
so that was a
conference would have brought
very
together the computer scientist and some of these other types of people.
Elliot Soloway gave a talk, I believe. Um, I don't remember about what. I'm blanking on some of the other people. I mean, those are the people I've really kept up with since then. There are others. I don't know who they were. Um, but yeah, so the learning sciences community started, being a community at about that time, and people um, people give credit to the journal and the way and the instructions that I gave um, that I gave reviewers, and also the conference, to building that community. And well, how many people? We had over 1,000 people at the conference this past last month.
Right,
900
right,
people there and 300 online. Yeah. So
right.
that was pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I just made a documentary, which is another episode of this podcast. So if you're
Mhm.
listening to this interview, look for the documentary episode. Almost 900 people Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that 1991, the very first one, and then you as the inaugural editor of that journal. So from the beginning, you had people like you're describing yourself developing artificial intelligence software. So these are computer programs that
That
could
was not
learn,
the biggest part
right?
of it. I mean, that was a small part of it. I
And
mean,
then
much bigger were part of it were these people like Marlene Scardamelia and Alan Schoenberg and Andy DeSessa, who were, and I should say Ann Brown too, who were coming out of, and Jim Greeno, and Bob Glazer, and you know, who were coming out of cognitive science, coming out of psychology, kind of cognitive science, um, and were finding that that was only part of the story of how people learn and how you help people learn.
right, right. So what do you think now that looking back all the way back through these decades, what would you say are some of the most important lessons or the legacies of these? I guess it's been 35 years now. The field is very strong. As you've said, there are 900 people at the conference. So it's clearly served a need. It's resonated.
So I think that Alan Collins's papers with John Seeley Brown and somebody else who I can't remember, Stevens, I don't remember, on cognitive apprenticeship are so much a backbone of what we do right now that people don't even remember where it came from. They don't even say cognitive apprenticeship, right? They're starting to a little more now, but they rarely know that that's where the norms are coming from. And cognitive apprenticeship is learning that it was actually developed. It actually was um, abstracted from um, the work of several people who were designing ways of making school happen in a better way. So Anne Brown was doing this thing called communities of learners, sustaining communities of learners. I can't remember what it was, but it was with elementary school kids. And they were um, they were working as a group of learners. I mean, they were working as a group of learners. There were several different, ways of interacting that she and her students were making happen that brought the social and the cognitive together. Jigsaw was one of those. I can't remember the other one. And they were asking questions and figuring out how to answer them. And the teachers were playing certain roles, and other mentors also. Um, Another person how I already mentioned was, and that was elementary school kids. Another person was Andy DeSessa, and he was teaching physics. And he had this way of teaching physics such that he was modeling for the students and then coaching them through doing it themselves. And Alan Schoenberg, I think, was the third one that I can't remember. I think that was the third one um, that they were looking at. I can't remember. And and they abstracted. What is it that's going right? In these situations, these people are very creative. They're using what we know about learning in very creative ways. Now, what kind of approach comes out of that? And cognitive apprenticeship focuses on the teacher acting as a modeler, as a coach, and as a scaffolder. So a coach kind of helps with what comes next, and a scaffolder helps with making that happen, doing that well. Modeling means showing the learners, and then doing it in an environment where it's very natural that the learners are all at different levels. I mean, they might all be at different levels within a very, very small, within a very small space, but where they're helping each other, the peers are helping each other learn too, and doing that same modeling and coaching and scaffolding for their peers. Um, it's based on apprenticeship, as has been done for centuries, but figuring out how to make it work for learning cognitive skills because they're invisible. So there's really this need to model and talk along with the mob. What am I doing when I'm doing this, and why am I doing it that way? So that's one of the things that's been very, very important to the field. Another one is design-based research. Okay, how do you do research in the natural world? Okay, and research where you want to find out how to make something work and also extract theory from that. In much the same way I talked about, never thought of this before, but in much the same way I talked about Alan and John and their other collaborator, looking at these three ways of doing things in the classroom and coming up with that with cognitive apprenticeship, but also theories about learning itself. And design-based research is a method where you start with your very best understand. You start by having some issue that you want to study, and you use the very best of what is known about what might be happening as people are learning in that situation, and use that to design a first pass at a way to make that learning happen. Whether it's in a classroom or a community center or wherever it is, a library. And then you predict, what does the theory tell me about what I expect to happen? Not just what I expect people to learn, but what I expect them to be doing socially, on paper, on the computer. What do I expect them to be doing along the way? What do I expect them to be thinking along the way? And you collect data about those things, getting very close to the learners. So it's an observational thing. And then doing comparisons between what was observed and what was expected. So that was kind of like your comparison group, sort of. And then going back and saying, oh, okay, so why did this thing happen instead of that thing? Or why did this thing happen in addition to those other things? Or why didn't this thing we wanted happen? And going back and using that theory that was used for the design of that situation, that learning approach, to debug it, and then trying again. And because you're using that theory that you started with to debug what happened, figure out why it's not working the way you thought, or why it's working better than the way you thought, there are also ways of expanding on the theory that was being used and making it more specific, maybe coming up with some new theory along the way. It's a slow process, very slow process. So that's another really important thing. Another one that I'm thinking about is the idea of funds of knowledge. I don't know if you've heard of that. Do you know what that is?
Oh, of course, absolutely.
Of course, okay. So funds of knowledge and taking an asset-based approach to looking at learning and to designing to make learning happen means paying really big attention to what the learners are bringing to the learning situation. Not just their prior knowledge, which, everybody in education talks about prior knowledge. So funds of knowledge is not simply prior knowledge, though it includes that. But it's all of the common sense stuff and expertise that the learners bring that comes from the life they've been living. And how can that be taken advantage of? We ask the question, how can that be taken advantage of as we're designing? And so rather than thinking when we're trying to design ways of helping people learn, we don't say, what are they missing, that we need to help them learn to get up to here? We say, what are they bringing that we can build on to help them build up to here? And it's a whole different attitude. I mean, it doesn't sound a lot different, but it's a different attitude that goes into design for learning.
It's a really impressive record, I think, for a field that, well, it hasn't been around forever. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe now in 2026, 1991 might seem like a long time ago, but for you and I, it seems like yesterday. you're a little older than me, but not that much older. In the 1980s, I was doing expert systems for banks. In my case, that was before I was doing education as well. So you were telling me before we started, we're getting ready to wrap up our interview, but I wanted to ask you about what you're doing right now. We've spent a lot of time talking about the history of the learning sciences, but we're
Yeah.
both still active researchers. You told me that you're working on a
I'm
new
working on
book.
a
So,
book.
yeah. So, what are you
So,
doing?
many years back, I sat down with Alan Collins. I was going to write a book on everything I know, um, which people told me I should write. Okay, I didn't know what I was going to call it, but I thought about everything I know. And he and I sketched out a table of contents. But that's, I'm going to write that in a particular way, or I'm working on writing that in a particular way. And that is that I talked about my early research, but I became a learning sciences researcher. I became an educational researcher along the way, using what I had learned about learning from experience to design a way of doing um, science education for middle school called Learning by Design. And what we recognized was that this iteration towards understanding, iteration towards doing a better job of solving problems that we'd been implementing in the computer as case-based reasoning, also gave some, um, made some suggestions about how we might help people learn in school. That maybe we should be helping them have experiences that they're going to get excited about and want to reason about and build knowledge from. Okay, and also case-based reasoning was telling us some things about the kind of processing of experiences, cognitive internal processing of experiences to leave them in memory in a way so that they could be remembered, and then the processing that's needed to figure out what do I know that can help me. And I worked on this approach called learning by design for many years, and it was really neat. I mean, we had people learning physics of motion, um, from designing toy cars, making them go over hills, making them carry loads, um, putting alternative propulsion systems on them and, seeing what happened and explaining all of that. That was the first thing we wrote, the first unit we put together. And teachers we worked with loved it, though some of them couldn't get it. But Teachers we worked with loved it. The students loved it, and they were learning all kinds of things besides just the knowledge of science and the practices of science that we wanted them to learn. And so I thought that I should do a whole curriculum for middle school. So I got involved for, a lot of years um, with people. I was still at Georgia Tech. I got involved with people from Michigan, Joe Krajcik, and from Northwestern, Brian Reiser, and um, Danny Edelson. And they were working on a project for urban school that was, really starting from the same learning theories that I was starting with. And there were a lot of similarities. So my next many years were spent in putting together a published curriculum called Project-Based Inquiry Science, or PBI Science, that's got 13 middle school units and covers middle school science. And that taught me some things about actually making products. So I knew about doing design-based research, and I knew about designing for research purposes. And then I was exposed to designing products, working with a publisher to do that. And in the last 7 years of my career, I was at Boston College, and I was developing and then teaching a master's program called Learning Engineering. You can ask me about that. It was a master's program in learning engineering, was what it was called, but it was about I was teaching master's students to design learning experiences, to design learning products, is what I should say. Software, curriculum approaches, curriculum itself. Um, um, I did say software. Services, a lot of different museum exhibits, outdoor installations for learning. All those things, my students, games for learning. So I was teaching them, and that program's no longer being offered. But along with my colleague, Kathy LaChapelle, we developed, we articulated a process. I mean, both of us were experienced at doing this design, but we'd never actually articulated the process before. So we articulated a process, and a lot of tools to go with it to make it easier to take into account all the issues you have to take into account to design learning products. And I'll say some more about that in a moment. And we designed design diary pages, design journal pages, and we want to make that available for others who are designing for learners. And what's so hard about designing for learners, you might ask? Was that your next question? Well, the thing is that you heard me talk about funds of knowledge. Everybody comes into a learning situation not only with prior knowledge, but also with things they've learned in life, also with things they're interested in, also with things they have difficulty with, also with attitudes, and that all makes a difference. Not only does that all make a difference, but if we really want everybody to learn, we have to take into account all that variation. And if we want to design products that are going to be used in a lot of different situations, we also need to take into account the variations across all of those situations. Now, you can't do all of anything. It's too hard. But the process the process focuses on getting at the variations that you really need to focus on and designing uh, with those variations in mind. It's a human-centered process. It's an engineering design process. It's a human-centered design process. It's a learner-centered design process. It combines all of those things with each other.
Right. And what are you calling the book? You led into the summary by saying it's everything I know.
Oh,
So,
yes. So now I have to say what we're calling it. Um, Designing engaging and impactful learning experiences, a practical guide. That might change.
right, right. Thank you. No, that sounds like a book that a lot of people could benefit from reading. So it's exciting. I'm
Yeah,
excited
and
to
in
hear
one
that.
way or another, it will include everything I know.
Right. And with a lot of practical implications.
With a lot of
Yeah,
practical advice. That's right. Yeah.
right, exactly. Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. And again, this is the Science of Learning podcast. And my guest is Janet Kolodner. If you've enjoyed this conversation, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. And Janet, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
You're welcome. May I also put in a plug?
Absolutely.
Maybe if you like it, you'll want to check out the International Society of the Learning Sciences. I was actually one of the co-founders of that. And the Journal of Learning Sciences, you already heard that I was the founding editor in chief. Also, um, this nascent this nascent practice called learning engineering, um, called learning engineering. You might want to check all of those out.
Absolutely. And I'll have all the information about that in our episode description and links to your webpage and to isls.org, which will be the International Society for the Learning Sciences. And if you subscribe to the channel, you'll have access to things like my documentary of the annual conference for 2026 with a lot of information, including an on-site interview I did with Janet Kolodner. So again, thank
I
you
was
for
very popular at that conference, wasn't I?
that's right. Yes, all the way back from the first conference in 1991, and continuing to next year's conference in Bombay. We haven't even talked about the international dimension
Yeah.
of the society. This is not just a United States endeavor here. Scientists all over the world are interested in the science of how people learn, and
Yeah.
so we all travel quite a bit. I know you do as well, and the Cambridge Handbook of Learning Sciences, which I edited and which Janet was advisor for, the first edition, has been translated into Chinese and been widely used internationally. So again, this is the Science of Learning podcast. I'm Keith Sawyer. Please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment if you are interested, if you want to make suggestions for future episodes. And thanks for watching.
Thank you. Thanks to everybody for watching.
Janet Kolodner is a leader in the learning sciences, and I really enjoyed our conversation today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel and watch our other episodes in the Science of Learning podcast.